Thanks so much for taking time to join me in this series on Masterful Living. It's been a good series, and I hope that it's benefited you and those that perhaps you shared this with. I come now to the final descriptor that I'd like to talk with you about, a descriptor that evidences or that is a characteristic of people who are on the way of masterful living. Remember, living full of the Master. And the resulting telltale signs of people who are walking on this journey of welcoming the fullness of the Master into your life through an act of surrender. You see, we don't welcome God fully into our lives by trying harder. We welcome the fullness of God into our lives by being vulnerably surrendered to God. And then God's nature begins to permeate our soul, our lives, everything we do, and we are changed. And those changes are visible in these kinds of descriptors. The last one I want to talk to you about is what I call a restored self. And this one isn't always as visible as some of the others because it's really going on inside the nature of who we are. Restored self. Now, the very term restored implies that there was something that existed previous that became not restored or became broken or became warped or became disintegrated and is now being restored or put back into its original form, or the intended, better word, the intended form that God had in mind when He created us. And this goes back to the very beginning of God creating you. When God created humanity, He created us in God's own image. That image was whole. That image was integrated. That image was full. That image was a perfect reflection of God's own nature. But as we've talked about before, by our free will, by our own choices, by our own autonomy, by asserting our own selfishness, which is the essence of sin, by the way, by asserting our own selfishness, that image became broken because we were cast out of the garden and we were no longer in close proximity with God, so we could no longer reflect God perfectly. You take a mirror away from the original image, and it can no longer reflect that image perfectly. So in that condition of being estranged or separated from God, we are no longer able to reflect God's wholeness perfectly. We are no longer able to live in the condition that God first created us to evidence or to reflect or to be. And we're broken, we're warped, we're disintegrated. And so one of the evidences, the telltale signs of people who are walking on the journey of masterful living is that their life begins to be put back together again or be restored into that original vision that God had for you. Whole, integrated, fulfilled, thriving, reflecting God's own nature. And that only comes about through surrender. It doesn't come about by trying harder. It doesn't come about by living up to a formula. It doesn't even come about by walking the 10 steps of discipleship. It comes about by an act of surrender to the influence of God in your life. Remember, the essence of sin leads to us saying, "Not your will, God, but my will be done." And then Jesus reversed that prayer when He said, "Not my will, but yours be done." There's surrender. There's vulnerability. There's transparency. There is the openness to God to come in and reform, restore our lives by reconciling us back to Him in close proximity. And that image is put back together again then. So a restored self is built on that scriptural passage where God created us in God's own image. And now, as we surrender ourselves to the influence of God, God begins to put us back into the condition that he first envisioned us to be. You see, God envisioned you in a certain way. God has a vision for your preferred future. God has a vision for your very life, your nature, your priorities, who you are. And God wants you to be restored back into that condition. But for our choices, our selfishness, God is able to put us back together. If we continue to make choices that take us farther and farther away from God, if we continue to make choices based on our selfishness, our own desires, it continues to broaden the space between us and God, and we cannot reflect that image. But when we make choices of surrender to the influence of a holy God, now we are coming back into closer proximity, and the image within us is being restored. Myself is becoming more and more what God intended for me to be. And that only happens when I surrender control, when I surrender, when I open, when I allow the influence of God to saturate my life. So you see, a restored self is one of the key results, one of the key observable descriptors of people who are walking on the way of being full of the Master. Their life begins to be redirected, put back together, renewed, refocused, restored in the image of God. That is the ultimate desire for God in your life. It doesn't happen in a moment. It requires a decision on your part to place faith in God through Jesus Christ, but it happens over a progression of redirecting your choices to surrender rather than selfish. And that self begins to be restored in God's image, not your own desires. A restored self is everything that God has in mind for you, and he's made a way. He has that desire. His deepest passion for you is that you be restored in who you are, to become increasingly what God envisioned for you to be. To use other words, for you to be your best self. That's what God has in mind for you. However, God always adheres to the choices we make. And if your choice is to focus on something other than God, God's holiness and God's transformative, restorative work in you, God will not impose himself. And you continue to separate yourself from God, becoming what you want yourself to be. I just want to remind you that God has a vision for you, a vision of wholeness, a vision of thriving, a vision of flourishing, a vision of everything that you can possibly be, a vision that fulfills his image, his vision for you when he created you. And that requires that you set your sights on being full of the Master. That happens through surrender. Surrendering your agenda, surrendering your priority, inviting the fullness of God into you, and the telltale sign of restoration begins to occur as you are being restored in the image of God. May God bless you richly on the journey of masterful living.